We're continuing our saga with Elijah, one of the most important prophets and also one of the most difficult to work with in our 21st century sensibilities. So to recap, what happened last week? Does anybody remember?
He had to rest.
He had to rest, right. And why did he have to rest?
Because he'd given up.
Mm-hmm. He'd given up because the queen, who brought her own religion into the land of Israel, caused him to set up a challenge to see whose God would bring fire down and burn up the sacrifice, whether it would be Baal or the God of Israel. Well, the God of Israel won, and Elijah had all the prophets of Baal killed. And so in retaliation, Jezebel had all the prophets of Israel killed, and he was the only one left. And he went out into the desert and said, "Just kill me now, God. I'm no better than my ancestors." And God said, "Why don't you eat something? Take a nap." And then eventually he goes to the Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, and God goes, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It's like, I am the only one with any zeal for you. Like, they've torn down your altars. They've killed off all the prophets, and now they seek my life. And that's where today's story comes into play. Now, ideally, it would be nice if they could have coexisted. Interfaith dynamics, interfaith relationships. I am on the leadership team of the Interfaith Council of the Tri-City area. These are things that I certainly value as a thinker that thinks that God transcends all these things. But in this context, it was literally life or death, whether or not you were faithful to your God. Because in this time and place in history, it wasn't that there was only one God. It was, my God is the God for me and this community. It's called henotheism. Trivial information? Check. So today, God says, "Okay, I fed you. I let you sleep. I've reminded you that even in the firestorm, the great rushing wind and the earthquakes, I am not there. I am in the still, small voice." And that still, small voice says, "Okay, go back the way you came to Damascus, anoint, and bless you, Ian, for trying to deal with these names because they are really hard. Where are you? Hazael as king over Aram, Jehu son of Nimshi as king over Israel, and then Elisha son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah as prophet in your place." Now, what's significant about this, there's three people that get anointed. Two are kings, and one is the next prophet. But Hazael, as king of Aram, will eventually restore the altars that had been broken down. It's one of Elijah's complaints taken care of. Then Jehu, son of Nimshi, will punish those who killed all of the Israelite prophets. There's complaint number 2 resolved. And then Elijah isn't going to live forever. So he needs a protege, a disciple, if you will, an heir to his story. And so he chooses Elisha, who takes up the same kind of fervor that Elijah did. Sometimes a little bit more than I think is appropriate, like the fact that there's one point at which Elisha was being mocked by some teenage boys, because teenage boys are teenage boys, and he calls down a bear from the wilderness that eats them. I kind of feel like maybe you should give teenagers a chance to learn from their mistakes. Call me crazy. Needless to say, I don't approve of that, but I digress. So, the theme for today is this. Yes, you need to rest. Yes, you need to be able to yell and scream and kvetch and whine and complain. Sometimes whining and whinging is part of the process to get to where you need to go. It's best if you bring that whining and whinging to God, because God is big enough to deal with it. But God also says, now that you've rested, it's time to go to work. Now that you've rested, it It is time for you to faithfully uphold what I have called you to and to undo the damage done by faithless leaders. And that is the key of today's story. And not only is that the key to today's story, but there's so many layers of significance and meaning that are built into the combination of all three of today's readings. Note that the yoke is a significant thing here. Elijah was what number in the yoke of oxen? 12. Is that significant? A little bit? 12 sons of Jacob, 12 tribes of Israel, same thing, 12 disciples, kind of significant. But also, when Elijah says, go on ahead, what have I done to you? He's saying, I'm not stopping you. Go back and tell your family goodbye. And not only did he say goodbye, but Elisha did a strange thing. He killed the oxen that he was yoked to, and then used that meat to feed everyone. Similar to the Eucharist. The sacrifice is made as we move into our calling to feed one another. But the piece that I find most compelling in all this is the fact that Elijah did not stop when he wanted to give up. Did not stop when those who were in power and in charge were faithless to the covenant they were charged to uphold. Ahab, by allowing Jezebel to set up altars to Baal, betrayed the covenant of Torah, betrayed the covenant of Sinai, and betrayed the God of Israel. It's understandable that Elijah was less than pleased by this. And just as Elijah is the inheritor of Moses' legacy, so Jesus is the inheritor of Moses and Elijah's legacy. Again, Jesus set his face to Jerusalem, and they were going through Samaria, which is kind of weird for a Jew to want to do. They were kind of at odds with each other a bit there. And his disciples said, should we call down fire on them because they didn't receive you in Middle Eastern hospitality, just like Elijah did? He's like, no, what are you talking about? So Jesus changes it a little bit. Elijah tends to go tit for tat, you kill me, I kill you. Jesus says, no, they're wrong for not giving hospitality, but that's not what's most important. What's most important is I need to continue my faithfulness to what I've been called to do, and that burning people up because they make a mistake doesn't give them a chance to learn, and doesn't show the love of God, and doesn't show the fullness of the kingdom of heaven. It's hard when you want to burn the whole thing to the ground, which is literally what James and John were saying. Let's just burn it all down. This is wrong. This isn't cool. Let's just burn it. Jesus says, no, let's hold off on that. Let's channel that energy into something more productive. And just as Elijah challenges the leadership that is faithless, that betrays what they promised, God says, okay, I got you. Here's what I'm going to do. You're going to appoint the rightful leaders to restore this. God empowers Elijah as a prophet to ensure that those who need to be in place are put there. And Jesus reminds us that compassion for those who betray us is important, but ultimately the goal is to ensure that everyone is included at this table, and that those who are in charge are faithful. As Paul says, it's the faithfulness of Christ, not faith in Christ, that redeems those of us who are not part of the covenant of Israel. So our responsibility in all of this is to recognize and call to task those who are faithless leaders. Show them compassion and do what it takes to ensure that those who are in leadership are faithful. To ensure that all God's children are cared for. And that the differences that exist in all of God's children are respected. and that we don't deny the dignity of other human beings. It's a tough time. I'm sure many of you have been less than pleased with a lot of the things that have been going on in the world today. What we need to make sure is that we model faithfulness to God in a way that encourages the fullness of God's children, which does not just include men, and does not just include straight people, but it includes all of us at one table. Because again, as the dean of the cathedral when I first went to the Episcopal Church said, we don't need to agree on doctrine and theology. What we need to do is come to the table together. So may we be faithful to that love of God, love of neighbor, and love of self. May we remember to take that deep breath, take that rest, and yell and scream at the sky, because God's big enough to handle our yelling. That's the nice thing about our God. You get to yell at God. And then, when we've gotten that out of our system, we listen for that still small voice directing us to go make it right. Again, may we be faithful to the covenant that we have committed ourselves to with God and with other people. May we hold accountable those who claim to uphold things that are important to us in the love of God, love of neighbor, and love of self. And may we call out leaders who are faithless without dismissing their humanity, but also step into the fullness of what it means to ensure that those who are in charge are faithful, have integrity, do not lie, do not betray, do not denigrate, and do not undermine the human dignity of everyone. May we be faithful, and may we ensure that we listen where God is leading us to bring that faithfulness into all of our lives.